Sure, I have any questions.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming today. This evening we have the honor of hearing from Lauren Yero as she presents her new book, Under This Forgetful Sky, with Scott Reintgen. Lauren Yero is a Cuban-American writer who was born in Florida and lives in the mountains of western North Carolina. Her desire to connect more deeply with her Cuban roots led her to study and work throughout the Spanish-speaking world, including Chile, where she drew inspiration for her debut novel, Under This Forgetful Sky. Scott Reintgen is an author of YA and kids' middle grade books and a former public school teacher. The birth of his children has convinced him that magic is actually real. Thank you again, and remember to grab a copy of Yero's Under This Forgetful Sky or Reintgen's A Door in the Dark up front if you haven't already. And if you have any little ones in the family, come back later this week. On Thursday, we're having a workshop learning to sign with your baby. And on Saturday, we're having a special story time with author and illustrator Tatiana Feeney. So, thank you all.
We're here. First, thank you everyone for coming out. I know it's like you have a million things you could do, but you're here at a book event, talking books with us, and we really appreciate it. I'm just going to kind of kick off by asking Lauren a bunch of great questions so we can learn more about this wonderful debut. And we'll obviously have time for questions. So if you have something that's popping up that you kind of are hoping to ask, hang on to those. When we kind of finish a little bit more of our conversation, we'll kind of open it up, and we want to hear from you and want to talk about what you want to talk about too. So first things first, I think the necessary thing always, Lauren, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about your book? Like, give us that book pitch. What is this new book that you have?
Yeah, well, thanks, Scott. And thank you everybody for coming. This is my first real book event, so I'm really excited. Tiny bit nervous. Under This Forgetful Sky, it's a story of a stratified society. It's a story of star-crossed love and resistance in this world that's been divided by walls, and it's set in near-future Chile. And it tells a story of two teens who have to go on this journey together, but they come from really different backgrounds. And they're searching for a cure for a mysterious virus. One of the teens is named Rumi. He comes from Upper City, and his father's been infected with this virus. And he leaves his city to try to find a cure. And Paz, who comes from Lower City, is helping him, except she's not. She's secretly working against him. And so there's secrets, there's betrayal, there's a lot of feelings as they go on this journey together. It becomes complicated, but in a really lovely way, I think. So that's the pitch for the novel.
Perfect. It's a great. We want to know more, right? We want to know more. All right. So instead of diving into more questions, would you mind reading an excerpt?
I would love to. So I'm going to read from really pretty much the beginning, the first chapter, in Paz's voice. And so the novel's told in three narrative voices, primarily the two characters you see on the cover. And so I'm going to read from Paz's first chapter. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. When first we met, prisoned together in that cellar room, he was my enemy. He was a smooth-handed boy, a full-belly boy, a boy from Upper City. Las Oscuras had roughed him plenty. They'd taken his rich boy clothes and gadgets and tossed him on the bench across from me. His skinny brown chest was tatted and bruised, and his face was swollen. A long drip of spit and blood and tattoo ink dangled from his lip like a slimy spider web. He couldn't have been much older than me. Las Oscuras hadn't beaten me yet, just tied me up in that cellar room and left me to listen, while in the house above the boy shrieked like a demon cast into the light of God. I wondered when my turn to scream would come. Las Oscuras. My city feared their name more than they feared Sabrang or chems or bombs. Insurgents, some called them. Terrorists, murderers. Their inked up faces haunted our forests, and their presence hung over our city like a never-lifting fog. Most were too scared to even speak their name. But I wasn't so sure. In the twists of my guts and the holiest corners of my heart, I wondered how it would feel for their badge to burn on my skin, to be part of something big and powerful, instead of pushing all alone against the cold, new moon tides of the world. Gray light leaked through the floorboards above, and I peered into the cracks to try and catch sight of the tatted guards of Las Oscuras who stood there waiting. But the ropes that bound me made it so I couldn't move without tipping the bench where I sat. Hijo de puta, I said, into the dark cellar air. Across from me, the upper city boy's swollen eyes opened to slits. Hello, he said. Is someone there? He could scarce see a thing through the dark. Couldn't see that I was tied up same as him. Shut it, flaco, I said, my voice coiled like a snake. Shut it or I'll tat you again. I'll tat your eyes. The boy flinched. That was all it took. The wobbly bench beneath him pitched sideways and he fell to the ground. His face rammed into the dirt of the cellar floor. I laughed. There you go, I said. Eat your filthy tears. Taste them, just like you made us taste them. They're bitter, no? Bitter with tiredness and hunger and fear, and I searched for the words that would break this boy's body, that would mend the gash his people had torn in the world. But there were no words for such things. Who are you? The boy asked. My name is Paz, I said, then added, something you know nothing about. I'm Rumi, he said. I stayed quiet. I didn't want to hear his story. I didn't want him to know mine. Paz. That means peace, right? It means peace. Paz, please. Why am I here? Tell me what they want, please. You are the worms in my belly, flaco. You are the dirt in my mouth and the boot on my neck. Why should I tell you anything? Please, he said. His face pressed into the floor. Please. He started to cry and writhe against his bindings, quiet as a snake on fire. And I smiled. This boy's ancestors had built the walls. His kin had told us to eat dirt because they wouldn't give us their bread, to drink the ocean because they poisoned the rain. He was a filthy cerdo, a greedy little god, and he deserved to die.
Ooh. Yeah, absolutely. That's lovely. I think it's fascinating to me. I went on Goodreads and I looked at like reviews, which they tell you, by the way, it's like a sin. Like you don't go check your own Goodreads review page. It's like you never go there. But your reviews are like amazing. They're like really, really strong. All of them are great. And one of the things I kept seeing again and again and again was the beautiful language. I think that you can hear that absolutely coursing through that entire passage. It's just gorgeous. So I want to know, I'm like eyeing my questions, but kind of like willing to go off book here. I want to know, did it, like that's obviously at the beginning, right? That's towards the beginning of the story. But did your story start there? Or did it start somewhere else? What was the idea that kind of kicked off this story for you? And what did that journey kind of look like a little bit?
Yeah, so this is the first real chapter of the book, but it's kind of an in medias res beginning, like it's almost a little bit of a prologue, because then you go back and you sort of see these two characters before they come together. So, but the origin of the story itself, actually, it came from a dream.
Yes. That never happens to me, so that's glorious. I've been waiting for one of those.
And I mean, it was the kind of dream that that just stuck with me, and I knew it was a different kind of dream. But to kind of step a couple steps before that, what inspired the dream was I had been living in Chile. I had been working for this little Latin American guidebook, and it was my first job out of college, and I was kind of covering this central region from Valparaíso up to La Serena, and had just a pretty earth-shattering experience when you're traveling for the very first time alone like that. And it was my first time where So my family is Cuban, but I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, and it was the first time when I felt like I was in a place that my Spanish was good enough to just have those real meaty conversations with people. Yeah, and just the Chileans that I met wanted to have those conversations at every turn, and so we went political and philosophical and cultural, and it was just a beautiful time for me. So I came back with my brain kind of buzzing with all of those conversations, and then I had this dream. And the dream was of the city of Valparaiso, but it was completely transformed. It was sort of, the city itself is gorgeous and wonderful and full of life and magical and full of art. In the dream, there was something sinister and changed and something a little bit dangerous. And I wanted to investigate. After I woke up, I just scribbled it all down.
Like middle of the night? Like you woke up and wrote it down? Or was it morning? Like,
okay. I think it was morning, but it was like, pages of just all the details, everything I could remember. And then it stuck with me so much that I just wanted to investigate, how did this world come to be? I have such a powerful sense of this place.
Right.
And it became populated with these characters. This character Paz kind of grew out of that. And then I realized, like, this world wouldn't be without some other forces. It wouldn't be this way if there wasn't some other force causing it to be this way. Right. And that's where Upper City came from. And then
how far into the how deep had you gone in before you realized that? That's a big realization.
It was pretty early, actually.
Okay.
It was pretty early because it just seemed impossible that this world would exist in this exact way of this sinister danger if there wasn't some other force being exerted upon it. And then kind of came up with, realized, like, okay, who lives in these cloistered upper cities? And what would it feel like to be a young person who'd never left? You know, and then that this other character sort of came, and then I realized how they would come together. And so it kind of like grew out of a place. And came to character next and then to story.
Okay, this is a sidebar from the questions I had thought through, but I'm very curious, just like, how many people just have curiosity are writers in the audience, like also, right? I can't handful. Okay, so it's just fun to kind of hear like method and like how you approached it, because writing dual POVs, it's challenging. There's a balance to it. Mm-hmm. So was there one POV that like gave you a harder time than the other? Like that took more exploring or took more effort? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so they're really different voices, which was helpful.
Right.
But one of, like, Paz's voice, I would say, is maybe farther removed from my own voice, but I actually found it easier to get into it because once I had it, like once I had her way of speaking and her way of thinking and like the kinds of language and metaphors that she would use, it was kind of easy to go back in, whereas Rumi's is a little bit closer to my own, and so it took me a little bit longer to find his, but but I think, so even though she's a little more maybe different or farther from my own voice, I sort of found it easier to get into.
That makes total sense. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Okay, so that was a sidebar, but what I want to know, so this book definitely is like kind of delves into that like classic dystopian genre, right? Which like anyone who's like grown up reading, like we've had like so many great dystopian books over the years, and it's definitely a genre that like it ebbs and flows. Like I feel like big waves of it, and then it vanishes for a while. So obviously it sounds like the idea kind of spawned some of this, but when did you realize you were writing dystopian, and like what pushed you into like going full dystopia with it?
Mm-hmm. And I think this book is a little bit dystopian and a little bit soft apocalypse.
Right.
Like it kind of transitions a little bit. Like there's soft apocalypse.
Two great categories.
Yeah, it's a genre I actually.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just learned that term when I'm like, that's what this is, you know, which is like it's a kind of a post-apocalyptic setting, but it's really about character.
Right.
It's really about like the interplay of characters and not about, you know, just survival. And so like Station 11 is a good example of something like that. But I wrote this book the idea for this book came quite a long time ago, like 10 years ago. And I was you know, coming up with the notes for it, not yet drafting, and then the Hunger Games came out and I was like, oh.
Yeah, that one, yeah.
You know, just having a moment, and then, but I didn't, I put it away and took it back out and put it away, it wasn't until, recently that I in the pandemic actually, that I kind of gave it a chance to try to get it out into the world. And so, yeah, like when I actually wrote it, it was kind of when dystopia was having its moment.
Right.
And I hope, maybe I'll just put this energy out there. I think it's going to have a moment again with everything just that's happening in the world. Like there's something satisfying about the way that specifically dystopian speculative fiction can engage with those ideas.
Yes. And you mentioned earlier, like the idea that you had a reader who's like, I just didn't know I was craving this until it fell into my hands and I opened it up and I read it.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. Like we kind of dive back into the things that like either offer us comfort or push us to the edge and let us see what we're really looking at in our own world, kind of thing.
And that maybe it's an echo of something that you read when you were younger, or something that like younger readers haven't yet read, or that they haven't read something that's new, that's in this genre. And so I think there's a space for it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. All right, you said something there. I'm going to go on another sidebar because
Sure.
I feel like you said the words 10 years. That's a long time, because I feel like I've had this experience a lot. When you become an author, it is a very strange place to inhabit, in part because the majority of people you know don't know an author. And so you're like the first author they know. It's like this weird thing. They ask you a million very strange, funny questions. It's delightful. It's odd. But then one of the number one things that will happen, if it has not already happened, is you'll have like cousins, you'll have friends, you'll have random coworkers who come up to you and they're like, I have this great book idea. Do you want to write it? And you're like, I'm working on stuff, but let me hear it. No, it's just like this constant thing, because I think the assumption is like, hey, like I'll give you this idea, you go work for a month, and we we'll make some money off of it. Whereas like that's not always how writing goes. It's not often how writing goes. And so I'd love to learn more about like from idea to book. What did that look like? How like were you diving into it that whole time? Were you pausing at certain times? You said you came back to it in COVID, but what was that journey, and did it like kind of come spiraling out as soon as you came back to it? Like what was the journey from idea to publication?
Yeah, so I mean it was some stewing with an idea and note taking for a while, but then once I actually sat down to write the draft, it was maybe a matter of like 8 months that the book was a full manuscript.
Okay. Yeah.
Then I didn't quite know where to go from there.
What's next?
What's next?
I have this thing on my computer.
I have a lot of my family is here tonight. I have some perfectionist tendencies that might be like, it wasn't good enough for me, and so I put it away and then took it back out in these kind of intervals. And then,
so that 8 month period, you're writing it, you're diving in, it churns out, and then like there's this kind of sequence of back and forth. Right.
Yeah,
okay.
and it wasn't until COVID when I, took it out and said like I'm gonna give this thing a chance, and started to send it out to agents. Right. Yeah, it was actually. He's not in the room anymore, but the tall guy with the baby walking around was like, send it out already. That's my husband.
That's really awesome. What was
just a random tall guy.
The random tall guy with the baby. He comes and goes, yes. Was this the first book you queried then?
Yeah.
That's really unique too. That's really impressive. Those of you who do not know, it's like very difficult to query a book. I went through, now this is not my first book. So Door in the Dark is my 10th book. And then prior to that, like when I sent Nixia out into the world, that was not my first book, which is super, like I said, impressive. I went through three official query processes. I had 177 rejection letters. I stacked it up real nice and felt the pain of each of those, right? And I thought that was like a lot. I really did. It felt like a lot. It's very difficult to go through that process and feel like failure and like, almost. And then when I did one of my first events was with Marie Lu, who also delves into dystopia, is a wonderful, brilliant writer, like a very established pro. She's a New York Times bestseller. She like makes millions of dollars. She's awesome. And Marie, in the middle of my event, I was like, oh yeah, I've had 176 rejections. And she like politely tapped my shoulder and said, oh, Scott, that's so cute. She said, I have had 618. And I had those across 7 books over 8 years. So she, I like to think I would have kept on because I love to write and I love to create, but I also just like, that's a lot of things to go through. So I just wanted to, you know, like at least clarify for anyone who's here and is like not as familiar with that process. Very unique to just have like the first book,
but
which
I
is
took
really cool.
the 8 years to just.
That's right.
stew on it.
That's true. That's very fair. That's very true. All right. So getting back to my more formulaic questions, one of the things that I really want to discuss, because it's not dystopian necessarily that I want to hit on fully, but like tech and world building, and Rumi has these like amazing specs he has on, and you know, like I don't want to. Is it spoiling to say like what I mentioned earlier? Okay, I won't touch on it. But like, talk me through developing the tech. How, like you used I think it was in either what you were introing or what was in your introduction, the term near future, which I used in Nixia as well. And in part because Nixia, when you use near future, lets you get away with a few things, right? It's like, it's near future. Like, we're gonna have some new stuff, but like, don't worry about a specific date. I don't want to like get to that date and you guys think I'm wrong. So tell me about how you developed like tech, world building. What was the process for that?
Yeah, strategic vagueness is
It's great. It's lovely.
But yeah, the near future is to sort of distinguish it from like far future space travel, you know, this kind of more hard sci-fi. That's not what this is, but it's technology that you can sort of see the trajectory from where we are now. So like two kind of pieces of technology that I think shape the world or contribute to the world building they've got these heliocycles. So in these upper cities, they ride around on these little, really slick, small motorcycles that are solar powered. And the idea there is like, they've transitioned to renewables, but there's still this society that's based on unlimited growth, and it's still a problem. Like, there's still a problem with that, the way that society is structured, because it still contributes to these, like this extremely stratified society. But the other technology that is kind of prominent in the way that the plot plays out is these specs that they wear, which are, you know, glasses that they have to wear. They can't take them off in public, and so it kind of contributes to this sense of
forbidden.
It's forbidden to take them off in public. But they feel like, because they create this augmented reality all around them that's beautiful and is completely idiosyncratic to their experience, and so they can make themselves look however they want. They can make the world look however they want. They can change that with just a little like flick of their eyes, and so it feels like it's voluntary what they're doing, but it's truly a very surveilled space. And so it's kind of that sense of like, you know, technology as it seems like a voluntary thing that we've all opted into, but you know, it's also, you know, doing other things in the background.
And how'd you balance that though? Like, because it's one thing to think through what your system is, what you know about your book. How did you balance, like, what do I give the audience and how do I give it to them? Like, was there
what do you mean exactly?
Like in terms of like the world building, like you can't just give us a Wikipedia article of how tech specs work.
Right.
So like, what is your approach? Like whenever you're kind of doing world building like that, like what do you want to do in your work when you kind of hand those things to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it just sort of like, that's called, I think when like you're writing an early draft, you have these things called info dumps where you're just like, this is how it works, you know, and it's just like.
My later drafts have those too, so yeah.
Explaining it, and then you realize like, no, I need to find different ways for that to happen within the story. And so you'll see these characters moving from private to public spaces, and when they go into a private space, there's a privacy antechamber where they can actually, their specs release and they can go inside and have the privacy of their own home. And so it just kind of gives you that sense of like, oh, I see, that's how it works, you know, and you as a reader can understand like the forces that are at play there making this a requirement. So yeah, but it's there is a moment where Scott referred to.
Yeah, it's my favorite moment. I love that moment in these stories. Like I can't like hit on it. It's like you're waiting, like it's like that moment you're waiting for to like see a little bit of what's beyond, right?
Yeah, because Rumi has this sense of he's got this deeply dissatisfied, disaffected sense of you know, but he can't quite put his finger on it. And then there's a moment where there's there's a change where he can kind of see the world in a different way that relates to Spence. So
and it's briefly spicy too, which is nice.
Well, very, very YA.
A little spicy. And a little spice, little hint. Yeah. So I got one more question that I really want to ask, and then I'd love to turn it over to audience and hear what you want to know more about. So if you have things on your mind, just we're coming to that time. But I really love to kind of hear writer approach and craft and things like that. It's just some of my favorite stuff to talk about, and we all have things that there's no writer that I know of that's just I never read a book and I'm just really good at this. We just natural talent. Sorry, I grew up this way. So I think it's most of the time we read things, we watch things, we pull things in, and I think almost every writer has craft that they've pulled. I say stealing because I really almost mean stealing. We're not stealing their words, that's plagiarism, but we're stealing their techniques. We're seeing things they do. So I always say, if you like the way that I end my chapters, you like the way that Ursula K. Le Guin ends her chapters, she taught me how to do that. And if you like my action scenes, you like Marie Lu and Pierce Brown's action scenes, they taught me how to write those. And if you like how I do multiple points of view, I learned that from Lee Bardugo and Six of Crows. Now, they didn't sit down and do a tutorial with me, but I read their book, and I reread their book, and I reread their book, and I learned those things. And so I'm curious, who are your writer inspirations, the people either you pulled craft things from, or just inspiration, or I want to really do I kind of almost want to honor this author because I love their writing as I was a reader, whatever it might be.
Well, you scooped one of my whole.
Oh, who'd I take?
Ursula Le Guin.
Yes, you can have her too. We share, so enough authors to go around.
So my deepest influences are. It's more kind of a philosophical affinity, and so Jorge Luis Borges is just in there forever. He writes short stories. He's an Argentine writer, and the thing that I find an affinity with is just his little kernel that seems to be at the heart of all of his stories is an idea or a question, and this kind of philosophical, just wondering and curiosity that I just love. And I started reading him when I was, really young, and just it's always been there. It's
not to put you on the spot. Do you have a favorite story then?
So
I am putting you on the spot, literally. So sorry.
There's ones that I love for different reasons. There's Funes the Memorious, that's about a man who can't forget anything, and so he just carries all of his memories with him, and it's just beautiful. There's one, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's a person he's about to be sentenced to death. He's going to die the next day, and he prays for 100 years or something like that, and the wish is granted, but it's just frozen in that exact moment. And so he just experiences that moment for 100 years, and he observes the wing of a bee, and
so
it's just, and then he's sentenced to death. And so it's in the moment right before the
that reminds me of almost dealing with Fae, right? It has that twist to it.
It's not magical what he's doing. He's not right. It's not quite magical realism, but it's
on the edge of it.
It's on the edge of it. It's just this beautiful liminal space between reality and something else, and he's my favorite.
So that's one.
That's one. Someone who, for a similar reason, I love, but just the language, is Italo Calvino, who is an Italian writer. Just his use of just the perfect word, the perfect phrase, the perfect image, and just the delight that he seems to take in language, but he also has these kind of speculative stories, and he's got a lot of play. And he's got novels, but I love Consummate Comics. It's my favorite of his.
That's one of my favorite subgenres of authors, is people who just seem like they're playing in a sandbox, you know? They're having more fun than the rest of us somehow. You're what are they doing different? Why am I taking it so seriously if they just look like they're having a blast in each paragraph?
Yeah, and it just makes you be man, this is a cool world, and it just makes you treasure the world even more. And so, he's right up there. And he does some cool things with form, too, that I think are really neat. And then Ursula Le Guin. just the again, that kind of like that the idea that propels the fiction. And I like her essays. I think even maybe more than her fiction. I just like
She's got some excellent ones.
But let's see, more contemporary stuff. When I was working on this book, Laini Taylor's Strange the Dreamer.
I saw that referenced. I wasn't sure. You never know. Like when you see it in like an intro paragraph, you don't know if it's like, did the publisher choose it? Did the author choose it? Is it mixed? So I was curious.
Yeah, and she just does a beautiful, like she's a YA writer, and just like the way that she like writes emotions between characters, I just like, that was just, she does it just beautifully, and like
in these bizarre worlds that are
fantasy
like
worlds,
terrifyingly cool.
Yeah, but like the way that she writes romantic scenes for young adult audiences, I was like, that's what it feels like to be young and in love.
Age,
it was just beautiful. And then Paolo Bacigalupi, who writes kind of more, he writes cli-fi, so like climate engaged fiction, which is definitely a part of this book. A big part of it forms the backdrop of the world. And it's very much like, it's not a manifesto or making any kind of big like top down political point, but he definitely has a position that he's writing from, and I also have a position that I'm writing from with regard to that stuff. And so that was definitely something like, how do you make this a story that's complicated and that's not got an agenda specifically, that feels like it's playing with complex ideas and is helping people, or like giving people space to reflect on those ideas without it coming across as didactic.
And I did a panel with him, and he like obviously has like some apocalyptic elements, some dystopian elements, and he said there's one time where it was like 2017, 2018, where he was like, what's happening in our world right now was so intense and grim and dark at times that he had to pull a book, because he's like, whatever, like the apocalypse I was writing wasn't dark enough compared to what was happening in our world. And I was like, oh gosh, that's intense. That's like a great like group of authors to draw from. They're really wonderful.
And I think it's important. Like something else that is important that he does is like, there's hope in his books.
Oh yeah.
It's not just like The Road or something. It's just like, oh
man, people not great.
That's definitely something that I was trying to bring to the like. It's a dark book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of dark stuff in the book, but I hope that what you come away with is like a hopeful message for the future.
And that's like one of the most beautiful things about, I think, most of young adult is that, yes, we're willing to go to dark places. It's not like you're not going to get intense scenes that are really like just kind of gripping and take you to places you don't really want to go. It's just what we'll leave you with at the end is normally going to be that kernel or that little thread of hope that you can kind of keep tugging on, hopefully.
Yeah, which is not necessarily a happy ending, but like a hopeful ending and a happy ending don't have to be the same thing.
Not at all, I could ask a lot of things. I could listen to you read like the rest of your story, honestly. But what I'd love to do is kind of open it up to questions, hear what you want to know more about. They can be about writing, about our books, like really anything at all. But I'd love to go ahead and open it up to the audience. Any questions you all have? And it's going to be way more fun if you ask questions, I promise.
In all of your iterations, were you ever working with a critique partner or anything, or just all on your own?
No, not on my own. Yeah. Like I think when I was writing the original first draft, I did that pretty much I just needed to kind of clarify the vision that I had for the book, and so I did that pretty much without a lot of feedback. But then I had iterative feedback all along the way with lots of different critique partners. That guy read it like 30 times.
Can you confirm? Was it 30?
In total of all the little pieces, I'm sure.
Okay.
But I would sort of have in my mind like my bookish friends, writer friends who I was like saving. I was like, I don't want them all to read the same version because I want to save a new, so like I have a fresh perspective on this, because once you've read it once, it's a different experience, and so you kind of like, so you're like, okay, so it's going to go to this person next, and I'm going to get their perspective, and then but yeah, not on my own. There's a long list of acknowledgments, for sure. Yeah.
Full disclosure, this is like most of my writing group over here. So. Other questions? That's a good one. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you selected like the myths and the poetry that you have in kind of interspersed in? Because I think the myths are really beautiful and nice. I just started it, but like, yeah, I just feel like it's a lovely sort of break and also kind of a moving strategy. So I don't know if you can talk about why you included those and how you chose them.
So I'll answer those two kind of separately because they're kind of two different things. So the poetry that's in there, there's a lot of poetry that's actual, like there's several Chilean songwriters whose lyrics come in there. The poet Rumi, who's named this character, was named after. A lot of that poetry comes in, and that was just to kind of, I like bringing, like, that's just something I've always done, is always brought in other voices and just had kind of like other like little found pieces of other people's voices in the novel. So that was just part of the world building. The storyteller, which is what I think you're referring to in terms of the myths. So it's the third narrative voice that only happens periodically throughout the story, and you don't have a sense of how she is connected to the story until you get a little bit deeper in. And her voice actually happened in a later iteration of the story. Her voice wasn't originally.
That's interesting. Was it like a note that like someone gave you, or you just had that random inspiration?
No. So when I had the original novel, it ended in a certain way, and I'm not going to spoil. There's no spoilers here, but it ended in a certain way. And
properly vague. Thank you.
I wasn't. Yes, strategic vagueness.
Strategic vagueness.
I wasn't satisfied with the ending, but because a novel gets out of your control at a certain point, and there's like certain ways that you can't change it without it feeling false. I was trying to pull all these levers to have the novel end in a slightly different way, and it just wasn't working. And I realized I actually had to have someone who was in control of story itself make that change. Yeah. And so this storyteller, who had been previously just a character in the novel, became this third narrative voice that had a larger role in how the story actually unfolds and how it ends, and she has her own kind of arc.
That's
so yeah, awesome. It was like this idea of like, yeah, story. And what's interesting is, once you finish the novel, a lot of people, they have a different opinion on what actually happens at the end. Mm-hmm. And my hypothesis is, depending on what you believe about the power of story, is what you think about what happens at the end. So
nice.
Vague, but
but there is one end. It's not like recently there's like been a couple of books that are coming out, I think soon, that like they're printing it, so there's like 3 different endings.
There's one ending, but there's multiple interpretations of what is actually
actually. That's really cool. Yeah. That's really cool.
So I have an idea for a book.
Oh, yeah.
No, just wanted to hear more about the writing process. When you were writing the 2 main POVs, was there one that you kind of took the whole way and then wrote the other one to follow that, or were you writing them side by side?
I was writing them side by side, and it was interesting because sometimes I would write one chapter from one perspective and it just wasn't working, and then I would switch the POV and it was like, oh, that's right, that's when you. So it actually kind of unlocked things for me in the writing process, which was like I would get a little stuck in one voice. I would switch the voice and realize, oh, that moment needed to be told from a different perspective.
That's one of my favorite. One of my favorite things to do is show a completely pivotal moment for one character, but from the other person's POV. It just highlights it in a really unique and interesting way.
And there's this really interesting like tension and dramatic irony where like the reader knows what both are thinking, especially when there's a lot of secrets.
Yes.
And so you kind of have this satisfying sense of like, oh, but if only you knew, and you want to tell the character.
Pull those strings this way and that way.
So it's definitely a fun thing to do, to have one know something that the other doesn't know, but the reader knows all. So
it really is like a balance, because I feel like, so my writing groups here, my writing group, some of you may have been present. Like my very first attempt at a book was like 6 point of views, like very ambitious. I was reading Game of Thrones, like, and like it's so challenging. It's so hard to get the voices right. It's so hard to get the balance right. And like I eventually scrapped that because like I just didn't have the ability to pull it off. And so like it's interesting just to think about POV, like what you just said about your third POV is like one of the most fascinating things I've heard. And now I'm like, already I'm like, ooh, there's a tool for later. That sounds fun. Because I'm working on the sequel to Door in the Dark. And that one is complete. It has 3 POVs. And now I'm pressing on to write the third book. And I already am like looking at, I've literally got like a map at the start of my Word document that's like, okay, this point of view goes on for this long. I know that it's going to be imbalanced at the start of the story, so I'm going to give her more time so that he gets more time in the middle. But like learning how to like balance it, it's tricky, it's challenging. It's not just who's telling it, it's like how much story are they going to tell, how much are they going to cover, and more importantly, I think this comes up with Game of Thrones when I read it, is I have like 4 or 5 characters I love to follow, 2 or 3 characters I like to follow, and like 1 or 2 characters when their chapter comes up, I'm like, oh no, like not more of this person. So I think finding that balance of keeping all of the characters relevant and interesting it's tough. It's really hard. But
Chris, yeah.
Can you tell us about the decision to work with YA as a sort of like an overarching genre? And I know that you've worked as a teacher at different levels and different ages and are a parent, and I just think it's so fascinating to be able to modulate with like the idea of an imagined audience at a different age and how you thought about that, because I'll have like a 14-year-old or something ask me for advice, and I just start talking to them like they're 40 years old, and like skipping over all these like necessary steps that are just really, I find it hard to cast my mind back, to that. And so, it's just any thoughts you have about deciding to work in YA?
Yeah, and we can both probably.
Yeah, I got a lot of thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I don't think it was a decision to work in YA. I think it was the story that came. I realized it was a YA story, and I'm really glad that it's a YA story, because I think that's a really special moment to get to write for like that moment in a reader's life, when like those are the stories that I tend to, like the things that I came upon when I was that age are the things that I treasure most deeply, because it's your first.
You're writing their canon.
Yeah, you're writing their canon. Right. You're writing the first moment they have exposure to a certain set of ideas or ways of thinking, and it's really special. But the story and the characters that came to me, that's just like, I realized that's what it was. I had never written anything YA before, so then I had to just learn what YA was all about and read a ton of YA and like kind of learn about the way that voice is different, the way that storytelling and pacing is different in like for that particular audience. But yeah, it wasn't a top-down decision.
Yeah.
It was kind of like a ground-up decision. Like, oh, well, I guess I'm writing that. Okay, like I gotta figure out how to do that.
Yeah, for Nixia, which was my first book series, I distinctly had to choose. So I was in the very fortunate position where I had 3 different publishers who all wanted to publish the book. They kind of bid back and forth on it. One of them dropped out, and the final 2, one was an adult imprint and one was a young adult imprint. And the adult imprint actually offered me just a little bit more money, but relatively similar options. And I'm sitting there in another country. I was living in Switzerland at the time. And I'm sitting there thinking, like at midnight, like what's the right choice? Like what do I do? And I was a teacher, so I taught for 5 years. I taught at Jordan High School. I taught at Holly Springs High School, and like I knew I'd written it for them. Like it was for my students, and so it just kind of was an easy choice. Although like that book gets published as an adult book in the UK, and it gets published as an adult book in the Czech Republic. And so it's always interesting to see like where those lines are, and like we draw those lines in different places depending on who we are as readers. And like let's be real, like the young adult like as a genre, as an age, it is high school students, it is middle school students, but there's a ton of adults who read young adult because we have such a massive young adult like like what we grew up on was so pivotal and important, and it's when young adult really became what it is. And so I think there's just a lot to be said for like, you can write for that age without it. I mean, you get to kind of write for a very wide audience when you're writing young adult.
And we've all come of age, we've all experienced that, and there's something really powerful about that moment. So yeah, adults obviously enjoy like going back and reliving those feelings and those experiences.
So I'm hoping you can clarify something for me, because I can't stop thinking about it since it's been addressed. But so just paint the picture. There you are in the pandemic. You're working on your dystopian novel, and you say to yourself,
Gonna give it a shot.
Now's the time.
when a million other people are doing the exact same thing, what gave you the courage to say, I'm going to add mine to the biggest slush pile in history?
Well, I guess it was that I just was like, I'm either gonna do it now. I had a little, like a 2-year-old, and I was like, I'm either gonna do it now or it's never gonna happen. You know, I just need to give it a shot. And so, and there did seem, you know, like, so I wrote this pre-COVID, way pre-COVID, and there's a pandemic, and there's all kinds, you know, like there's vaccine scarcity, and there's all kinds of that stuff like that. And I was like, you know, I mean, when COVID, you know, like it happened, that when it was just starting out, I was like, oh, no one's ever going to want to read this. That's happening in the world, you know. But yeah, I guess I just it was a sense of now or never kind of thing. Yeah.
And it sounded too like you didn't have the slush pile in your mind, right? Like, because you weren't coming at it from like, I do think it's almost like sometimes difficult, because a lot of authors are coming from like, I know a lot about the industry already, and I'm trying to like think with the business in mind, but you were writing a story. Like, you were writing like from that approach of like, I just want to create this thing.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I probably wasn't as savvy as I could have been in terms of like.
But in like the best of
ways,
ways, though, right? In the best of ways, it freed you up.
It did, yeah, and it was that like. This is the story that I needed to write. This is the story that I've written, and I'm going to see if the world wants it. But I had a really different experience than you, because I got 7 rejections.
Yeah.
You know, and so, but like but I waited 10 years to get, you know, so it was a different experience.
We have a member of our writing group who's not here who got 1 rejection, and we just don't talk to him anymore. So we just leave him out. Yeah.
Didn't even tell him about the event.
No, he's not allowed to come. Other questions?
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned earlier dealing with perfectionism when you were writing.
Yes.
And I know, especially when I was a little younger, I used to like write things all the time, and they were probably horrible. But I think I haven't written anything in a long time, and I think I've gotten my own way a little bit with dealing with perfectionism. And I was just wondering, like, how do you deal with that when you're writing something?
That's a really good question. Yeah, because I mean, I think it can work to your advantage to a point, you know, because you're wanting to make a thing that you really believe in the best that it can be. And so it can actually be a really good trait to have to a point. And I think opening yourself up to like sharing your work with other people, once you feel like, hey, this thing, I've been working really hard on it. It's not perfect yet, but I'm open to sharing it and hearing what other people think. And then that can give it some new life and can kind of help you get past some of those blocks that just are like, oh, it's not good enough. Yeah. It's never going to be quite there. And then someone else reads it, and maybe they've got some suggestions, but a lot of times they have a lot of encouragement, you know, and so that can be a really helpful way to kind of breathe life into something that you're working on. Yeah.
Yeah, I took a living writers course at UNC, and one of the guest authors was Stuart Diebeck, and he said that he would sometimes go into bookshops and pull his book from the shelf and start editing it. And I was like, and he's like a great author, and I was like, oh, I don't want to be like that. So I stopped doing that. No, I'm kidding. I do think having people is so helpful, and it's harder to find, I think, when you're younger. But like, if you get the right people in your corner, like people that you meet with, and week in and week out, they find the things to praise about your work, but also the things to help you critique your work. If it's those two things hand in hand, it's like I don't know. I got to a point too where like once you get your first book edited by an editor, like you have to change so many things, and copy editors make you feel like ridiculous because you're like, oh yeah, I forgot it was summertime.
Do I even know grammar?
I don't know what the season is. I don't know. I don't know any of this stuff. And so I think there's a point where I realize I can only take it this far on my own, and I push it to that. I put all that I am in that book, and then I let it go, and then it gets edited, and it gets edited. And by the time it hits the shelf, it's the best thing I could have handed you. And I have to live with that, right? Like I might want to change a word here or there, but like I can live with the fact that like what I have put on the shelf is as much of me as I can make it, right? And it's hard to get to that point, but it took a little minute to get there.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, especially if you have those tendencies, it's not an easy thing to overcome. But recognizing about yourself is like the first step, and then recognizing that it can get you so far, and then after that point, you need to rely on other tools in your toolbox. Yeah.
This being your first book, what's been your favorite memory since sending out that first query letter to sitting here right now? What's been your favorite first book published memory?
Okay, I just had it. I just did it this past week.
Oh, okay.
No, this has been wonderful.
This right here, all of you.
I sent a copy of my book to my 7th and 8th grade English teacher.
Oh, that's the best.
And he doesn't know that I wrote a book, and his name is in there in the acknowledgments. And I wrote him a letter, like a little note, just thanking him, and that was the best moment that I've had so far. Because it was such a he kind of saw something in me as a writer and knew, like, believed in that and encouraged it in like a gentle way that like you encourage like a timid thing, like just kind of like giving me that little bit of like, hey, keep going, hey, this is really good, this is really special, like this is so it was that was my moment.
I think we have time for one more question, two more questions.
What was your revising process like? If you said you had the story simmering for a long time and it just had to, you sort of let it lie. Did that space make it easier to sort of like tear things down and start over again, or the fact that you had it set one way in your head for so long, you're like, well, this is the way it has always been, and I can't change it now?
My revising process, and I don't know if this changes after you have more than one book, but it's quite chaotic and random.
You might have to go faster. That's the main thing that changes. You might have to go faster.
Yeah. But the setting it aside and coming back to it is like, even if it's just for a couple of days, you just like set it aside, and then you have a little bit of freshness, and it was essential. Like, absolutely, yeah. And the longer you can set it aside and just not like, if you're just constantly touching and tweaking and everything, it's never fresh. But if you can kind of get a little space, that's
I find it so helpful. Like if I have a month between when I finish that first draft and then when I pull it back out of the drawer, it feels like I'm looking at it with a new set of eyes. I'm separated enough from it where I'm like, oh yeah, this scene's not necessary. Whereas if I would have read it like right after I finished, I've been like, this is my baby and I cannot let it leave. So I think there's something to be said for like that space, that distance is usually incredibly helpful. Yeah. One last question. It's always tough to be the last one.
Do you have another project in mind, and do you think you'll stay in YA?
That's a really good question. And
I probably should have asked that question. I'm sorry.
I don't
it's your debut week, so I didn't, but that's a great question. Yes. Tell us more.
So I have some ideas for working in the same kind of universe and with the same, some of the same characters, and kind of continuing the thread of the novel, but also kind of giving a little bit more about the origins of how things got to be this way. But I also have some excitement of, it's not anything specific yet, but some really, really nascent ideas about just doing something totally different and working more in the adult space, and doing something speculative in the adult space that's a little more in the like absurd Don DeLillo space of like, ooh, what would that look like? Because he's another writer that I totally admire and love, and is very different from what I've done here, but is like would engage a different part of my brain. And so I'm kind of like, but I have two very little kids, and so I'm like, how does that happen? How does one do it? So figuring it out.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've got book 2 coming out for this. So if you grab this, it's on the way. And then book 3 is after that. And if you're a younger reader, The Last Dragon on Mars comes out next year, which is like space dragons, basically. But yeah, it's always fun to kind of hear. I love hearing what's next, because it's like such a weird part of our job that we have to pump a book out into the world and say, here it is, and we're marketing it. And at the same time, we're like trying to get the creative burners on and work on what's next for us. It's like this, like very, there's a lot of splitness to it. But, thanks so much for your great questions. Y'all were wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much.
I don't say a thing.
Okay. If you, I'll say this: if you did not get it, like we're in here in time to sign, we'd obviously happily still sign for you real quick. So please do that. Yeah.
And I've got some cool stickers for you to pick up if you've got a book and you'd like one. Come and get one.
They're
at the
amazing
table.
stickers. Grab them. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Great.
Thanks so much. It was a great conversation. First time, not at all. Didn't feel like it. Didn't feel like it one bit. Oh.